Hey everyone, today we're looking at things in Dead by Daylight that at one time were useful but became useless. Starting off we have crows. Crows were actually sort of useful in the early days of the game, and it was largely because there was very little available aside them when it came to tracking. Back in 2016 in fact, upon the game's launch, up until early 2017 even, there were very few useful perks available. For tracking, killers basically just had two choices: Whispers and Spies from the Shadows. Perks such as Bitter Murmur existed back then, but were sort of terrible due to their original effects, with it only activating on the last generator completed. Tracking was quite an important thing back in the early days of DBD2, as the general atmosphere was also a whole lot darker, and survivors could blend in with the environment far easier. Stealth play was also far more common than current day looping. This made Spies debatably a meta perk, due to its ability to provide tracking. It was a very limited form of tracking however, and had restrictions that today seem sort of ridiculous, such as the fact that it only activated 75% of the time, as in, if a survivor triggered a crow, the perk only worked 75% of the time within a 36 meter range. Despite this though, it was still considered genuinely useful, and crows in general were a key tool in the killer's kit, where today perks and add-ons can generally pick up the slack. It also meant that the perk Calm Spirit, frequently memed on as one of the worst perks in DBD's history, was genuinely useful too, as it countered spies, despite it back then also only working a percentage of the time, with a 95% chance to stop a crow being alerted. So whilst crows today are still a useful tool for the killer to track survivors, they are comparatively quite useless compared to what they once were, an outdated mechanic that needs a bit of love and updating. Rank used to be something that actually had some semblance of meaning, with it being a number that did reflect your ability to play well somewhat. Your rank, nowadays called your grade, means literally nothing. It's simply just an indicator of how much you've played for the month. If you're Iridescent 1, the highest rank, all it means is that you played a lot during the last month or season, with it resetting every month on the 13th. This is all the ranks currently mean, and this has caused a lot of confusion, with many believing they do have more meaning beyond this, but they don't. Someone being a different rank than you does not mean they are any better or worse, and rank disparity does not indicate the matchmaking is flawed. It was partly for these reasons of causing confusion that the ranks were ultimately hidden from the pre-game and endgame screens. Original ranks looked a bit different, going from brown ranks all the way up to red ranks, with rank 1 being the highest and having a slightly unique look from the rest of the red ranks, with a different logo. These ranks only went up when you successfully appeased the entity with the emblem system. You had to gain pips to rank up, similar to how you do now, only back then you could also lose pips too, which meant there was some sort of stake that just isn't present nowadays. There was somewhat of a meaning, and even a competitive aspect to your rank, as it could actually change depending on how well you did. Ranking up all the way to rank 1 also became increasingly harder as the threshold for ranking up required higher emblems each time, meaning you had to actually improve how you played each game too. With these original ranks, you also did get match made depending on them. With this all said, they certainly weren't perfect, and it did still lead to a lot of game imbalance, as there were times where people could simply play so much that they'd eventually get to rank 1, even if they weren't conventionally very good. Ranks, or now grades, did at least have some more meaning though, aside a visual number with a BP reward. I do sort of miss the old prestige that came with rank 1. Chests are a weird one, and one that may be debated a bit, but I do think they're ultimately quite useless nowadays, where once they had more of a purpose. Chests are a feature of DBD that have existed from the very start of the game and its early days. They were originally very useful back in the day, as it was much harder to level up, with the Blood Web requiring a lot more BP, and for the fact that you lost all of your items every time you prestiged a character. That's right, when you prestiged, you lost everything. This meant as a casual player you genuinely wouldn't have many items readily available to you, and you had to be a bit careful and pick and choose games to bring items into. I remember when I started the game, even in 2019, when this was a bit further along, I always chose some games to bring items into and others not, because I wanted to save them. This made chests and their presence within trials very useful. Perks like Ace in the Hole, widely considered terrible today, was genuinely genuinely pretty solid early on too. And of course Plunderer's Instinct, a perk which lets you see all the chests and also increase your chest odds. Back then killer powers were also generally much more simplistic, and there weren't many secondary objectives or things to get distracted by, leaving you time to do things like open chests. Nowadays there simply isn't that time really. You have so many other things to focus on, and there's so much more going on in a trial usually. The other key thing is that the majority of players likely have hundreds of any given item across their characters nowadays, or at least enough that they won't run out anytime soon. I've had a flashlight selected on my Jill since 2022, and I've never taken it off, and I have over 300 still. And to the best of my understanding, that's pretty normal too. I've also only leveled her a handful of times. That's just how it is. You're overloaded with items nowadays. So what was once a useful mechanic and provided you with items in your downtime is now just sort of pointless. I'm not too sure how this could be fixed either. In recent times the devs have seemed to try and pull some attention back to chests, adding perks such as Specialist, Hardened, Dominance, and Human Greed to encourage interaction, but it just hasn't really worked out because chests fundamentally just don't provide all too much anymore. There needs to be something in them that otherwise isn't available as a choice in the pregame, a special or unique set of items maybe that provide a purpose for them. Moris are a mechanic that have gone from being completely overpowered and game-changing to now being a base kit mechanic, and sort of just a visual flair. Moris were a feature present from the game's inception, rare offerings that allowed you to straight up kill survivors once they were in the dying state. That was the only prerequisite for Moris back then, the original Moris on the game's launch throughout the early days. Survivors simply had to be downed, and then you could Mori them. The number you could Mori depended on which Mori you had. Ebony Moris allowed for every survivor to be Moried, Ivory Moris allowed you to Mori one survivor, and then the Cypress Moris allowed you to Mori the last survivor remaining, a bit like how Moris currently work. This made Moris incredibly game-changing of course, as they could completely alter the flow and direction of a game, allowing you to sometimes instantly remove a player from the game, making it completely unbalanced. Over the years, Moris slowly slipped from their overpowered status, requiring one hook first before use, to then 2 hooks, to the current day of the Cypress being base kit. This isn't to say that Moris should have stayed the way they were, but they've undeniably become far more useless over the years, essentially just being cosmetic flair at this point, where before they were a feature that directly affected gameplay in a huge way. Perks as BP multipliers. This is something that over the years has been slowly removed, with the devs seeming to not want perks to provide BP anymore. There was once a time when one of the most used killer perks in the game was Barbecue and Chili, and it was largely for the reason that it provided up to 100% BP gains for the match if you managed to hook each survivor at least once. Another popular perk for survivors was We're Gonna Live Forever, which provided up to 100% BP gains also, if you managed to do a number of altruistic actions, such as body blocking. They were pretty healthy perks too, which generally encouraged positive play. However, both had these effects removed despite this. Other perks with similar effects over the years have also lost similar effects, such as Hex Thrill of the Hunt, Beast of Prey, Prove Thyself and more. They've all lost their extra BP multipliers. Whilst this wasn't the most impactful feature of gameplay, it did originally make BP grinding a lot more bearable, where it was once quite irritating to do so. Nowadays it's not so much of an issue, but not having this option at all is sort of a shame I think. This feature is almost completely useless now too because, well, it doesn't really exist anymore due to its slow removal throughout the years. A similar thing can be said for killer-specific power interactions, with other things such as items, perks and more. Over the years there's been a clear point made that the devs do not want killer powers to interact differently due to a variable being in the game, such as an item or a perk. For example, the perk Adrenaline used to break you out of the dream world when facing Freddy, upon its activation. Saboteur was originally usable against Trapper and could permanently break his traps when used on them. Flashlights originally were capable of breaking Hag's traps, burning Wraith, and removing crow swarms from other survivors. All of these killer-specific features, however, have since been removed in order to create some balance among them. A variety of features once very useful, and almost these cool secrets that could counter a variety of killers, are now simply gone from the game. It's something I sort of agree with in the sense that it can be quite unfair when you're playing someone weak like Trapper or Wraith, and the survivors have something substantial to use against you, simply for a perk you're running, or an item you're using. But But these unique power-specific interactions did provide really fun aspects to gameplay, and moments of small adaptation required mid-trial, depending on what could appear. I do sort of wish we still had these, but hey, I get it. Rarity is something that is admittedly going to be quite debatable, and sort of hit and miss depending on how you view things, but I do think this is something that was once useful as a mechanic to actually rate things, where now it's just sort of not anymore. Looking at killer add-ons, for example, there's just no consistency. Some killers have their best add-ons as iridescent, others have their best as yellows and greens, and then there's some where their best are actually common. Perk rarity also means absolutely nothing anymore, with the majority of players unlocking tier 3 perks fairly quickly, and prestiging no longer resetting them either. There's just no reason for rarity anymore. Perk tiers used to have rarity depending on their strength, with particularly strong perks such as Sprint Burst, say, going all the way up to iridescent, where other perks such as Enduring only went as high as rare. There was actually sort of a scale and a reference point for how strong the perks were, or at least how strong they were meant to be within gameplay, and then at one point they all got normalized, so the highest was the purple tier or very rare, and the lowest was yellow or uncommon. The same could be said for items and offerings too, with iridescent keys once being some of the strongest survivor items in the game, and Moris, as mentioned earlier, being insanely busted. These things are sort of lost nowadays. Rarity is sort of a useless reference point. Let me know what else you think has become useless that was once useful. Thanks, and goodbye.